All right, Crim 1, here we go with Chapter 8. So we are moving on from working on or learning about law enforcement and moving into the court system. So I know that some people consider court, I don't know, maybe even boring, but trust me, having worked in a courtroom for about 8 years, there's nothing boring about courts. So we'll start with the concept that we in the United States have a dual court system. And by dual court system, that refers to state courts and federal courts. So, this concept is just as simple as it sounds. Federal crimes or cases in which a federal crime has been committed will be heard in federal courts. And in cases where a state law has been violated, those cases will go into a state court. So an example, and I think I might ask this on the quiz, I can't remember now, but an example of a federal crime would be something like bank robbery. So comparing bank robbery to maybe robbing the grocery store, okay? So either I robbed a bank or I robbed Vons, okay? So if I robbed a bank, because all banks in the U.S. are insured by the federal government, that FDIC, that makes it a federal crime. If I were to rob Vons, the grocery store, then I would be violating a state law. So I would go into the state court system. Are there other types of federal crimes? There are a lot. Anything that has to do with the postal service, with money, with counterfeiting money, things like that. So there are a lot of federal offenses, but generally speaking, most of the court cases that go through the court system are through the state courts. So when we're talking about the concept of jurisdiction, it's different with courts than it is with law enforcement. So a lot of people would consider jurisdiction like if I work for the Fresno Police Department, my jurisdiction is the city of Fresno. Okay, so that's the law enforcement side. Now, jurisdiction of the courts is referring to which court has power over what particular issue. So let's say I was under 18 and I committed a law violation. I broke the law. What type of court would have jurisdiction over that? Well, a juvenile delinquency court would have jurisdiction over that. So jurisdiction, it's the court that has power over whatever the particular issue is that's being addressed. If I were suing somebody civilly, that would go into a civil court. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about jurisdiction as it relates to court. What court has power over whatever particular issue? There are other courts. If I am going through a regular state court or a regular federal district court and I am the defendant and I think that my rights were violated somehow and that my trial wasn't fair, I can ask an appellate court or an appeals court to review the lower court's decision. Okay? So they have the power to look at the case, go through all the transcripts, all that kind of stuff, and decide whether or not anyone's rights were violated. Yeah. We also have drug courts. Drug courts are pretty common. A lot of times a first-time offender who is arrested for a low-level drug offense might be eligible for a drug court. Drug court is generally 6 months-ish, and people will be directed or ordered to attend substance abuse treatment, be drug tested, and then not violate the law in any other way during that 6-month period. They also have regular court dates to check up and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. If they do everything they're supposed to do, go to drug counseling, test clean, and not get any new law violations, at the end of the 6 months, generally speaking, that case is dismissed and sealed like it never happened. So it's a diversion program, the drug courts. And youth courts are very similar. These are at the high schools, though. Low-level first-time offenders who may have committed a crime, maybe even at the school, will have an actual judge come out to their school and address the case. The jurors in those types of cases are usually other students. And again, if the defendant complies with all the terms as agreed upon by the judge and the other student jurors, then the case gets dismissed and sealed like it never happened. So wherever you went to high school, you probably had a a youth court. You may not have known about it, but I know we had one at Hoover. So next slide, let's go. Come on, there we go. Courtroom work group. Whew, that's tough for me to say for whatever reason. Courtroom work group, it's hard. Anyways, meeting in chambers. Meeting in chambers is just meeting in the judge's office. Usually it's with the attorneys, but when a judge says, let's meet in my chambers, that's just saying, let's meet in my office. A recusal, this is when a judge removes his or herself from a case. What are some reasons why a judge might recuse themselves? Let's say, for example, the lead attorney on the case, the prosecutor, is married to the judge. Probably there's a conflict of interest there, and the judge should recuse himself because obviously presiding over a case with your spouse as one of the two participants would not be a good idea. Due process. So we all, if you were to follow a case throughout the court system, there are a lot of steps, and all those steps are in there for a reason, so that we, the people, are protected. And those are due process rights. Things like not having to speak against yourself, having the right to a speedy trial, having the opportunity to confront witnesses. So due process is the entire, I don't want to use the word process again, but the entire process by which the case goes through the court, and it's done so in a very specific format and for a reason, so that our rights are protected. So who else works in a courtroom? If we were in class right now, I would ask you all, like, who else do you think works in a courtroom? So we're not in class, so I'll just tell you. There is a prosecutor. That's the person who is representing the state or the federal government and is attempting to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Then you have a defense attorney. That defense attorney is doing everything they can to protect the defendant's due process rights, constitutional rights, and make sure that the case is fair and that the defendant is protected. There might be there should be probably a court reporter. That's going to be a person who takes down everything that is said in the courtroom. You're going to have a clerk. That's someone that would document everything, make sure all that the documents and paperwork is in order. Of course, you would have a judge. The judge is responsible for maintaining order in the courtroom, maintaining the process in a fair and equal manner. You might have a bailiff. Bailiffs are usually they're usually sheriff's deputies who are in charge of making sure that the courtroom is safe. You could have interpreters. You could have victim advocates. You could have other CASA, court-appointed special advocate volunteers. Generally, in the adult world, in sentencing courts, you're probably going to have a probation officer. In the juvenile world, you're going to have a probation officer for every hearing. So there are a lot of people that could be involved in the courtroom work group. And then at the very end here, you'll see it says different types of judges. So you have judges. These are people who are either elected or appointed by the governor or the president if it's a federal case. But there are other people who kind of sit in as judges and act as judges without being actual judges. I know it gets complicated, but just for example, they have things called commissioners. Now, commissioners are not actual judges, but they serve in the same function. So what would happen if you had a commissioner hearing your case? You, as the defendant, would have the right to know that that's a commissioner and not a judge, and you would have the right to ask for a real judge if you wanted to. We also have things called judge pro tems, meaning like part-time. Part-time judges can be attorneys who maybe sit in while a judge is on vacation or something like that, and they act as a judge during that period of time. Again, the defendant has to be made aware of that and has to agree to have that person hear their case. So what is next? Prosecutor. The prosecutors are generally, that's going to be your district attorney. In Fresno, the head of the district attorney's office, or the district attorney, is Lisa Smitkamp. And everyone below her are deputy district attorneys, and they prosecute the offenses. There are times when a special prosecutor could be appointed. These are usually in very highly political cases. You've probably heard this phrase before if you watch the news at all, because a lot of politicians and family members and things like that will be investigated by a special prosecutor. An attorney general is also there's a federal attorney general, and there are state attorney generals. So these are attorneys from a different office that sometimes will come in and handle cases where there might be a conflict of interest. So let's say, this is not true, this did not happen, but let's say Lisa Smitkamp's husband got arrested and he was being prosecuted. Would it be reasonable for the Fresno County DA's office to prosecute him? And the answer to that question is no, because there would be a conflict of interest. They work for Lisa Smitkamp and it's her husband. So in instances like that, they might bring in the Attorney General's office, a state office, to come in and handle the case if there is a conflict of interest. Do prosecutors have any discretion? Absolutely they do. They do not have to prosecute every case. They can dismiss cases in the interest of justice, and that can be the end of it. So yes, they do have discretion. What are some problems prosecutors face? There are a lot of problems that prosecutors face. A lack of witnesses, a lack of resources, huge caseloads. There are prosecutors that, if they're working in certain courtrooms here in Fresno County, might have upwards of 70 cases to handle in a day. So they do have a lot of issues to face, which is why discretion is really important for them. They cannot prosecute every single case. They physically couldn't. So defense attorneys, most of us would think of the public defender's office when we think of defense attorneys. But public defender's office is a county office where attorneys work for the county, and they are assigned cases for people who, generally speaking, can't afford their own attorney. So these are county employees who are attorneys that represent people who cannot afford their own attorney. Then we have private attorneys. These are just that. These are attorneys that people will pay out of their own pocket to hire in order to represent them. Attorney-client privilege. So anything a defendant tells their attorney is protected under the attorney-client privilege, meaning that the attorney cannot share that information with others, unless they're threatening to kill somebody or something like that. But generally speaking, anything a defendant says to their attorney is private. What are some problems defense attorneys face? Pretty much the same problems that prosecutors face, but probably times two. Their caseloads are huge. They have pretty difficult cases, pretty difficult clients to handle. Again, they could be handling 70 cases in a day, and it's really difficult to give someone good representation when you are so overwhelmed. So that is defense attorneys. Juries. All right, so a grand jury is different than a petite jury. You'll see those two here on this slide. So let me start with a petite jury because it's a little bit easier to explain. Any of you who get those notices in the mail that tell you to report for jury duty, that is a petite jury. That's a normal, just your normal jury. When people, citizens are called in from the street and they are sitting through a trial and deciding basically if someone is guilty or not guilty. Okay, so that's a petite jury. A grand jury is a panel of citizens who work together for a decent period of time, 18 months, 2 years. It depends on the jurisdiction, but They may investigate certain crimes and determine if sufficient evidence exists to bring a defendant to trial. So ultimately, these grand juries are groups of people who work together frequently, and they decide if there's enough evidence to go forward in a case. And that's really all they decide. They are not deciding guilt or innocence. So that's a kind of a big difference between a grand jury and a petit jury. Voir dire is the process where the attorneys are questioning prospective jurors. And I went through this probably in 2022 or 23. I'm not really sure. I can't remember what year it was, but this is an exhaustive process. They ask obviously, I don't know if they ask your name now that I think about it. Anyways, they ask your level of education. They ask who lives in your house with you. They ask if you have any kids. They ask where they go to school. They ask if you've ever had law enforcement contact before. They ask where you live. I mean, it's exhausting. And then they'll ask you some questions to see how you feel about whatever the particular case is. Mine was a child abuse case. So they asked, had I ever had contact with CPS and blah, 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 which was interesting because, of course, I was a probation officer for 20 years. So anyways, and yeah, I did get picked on that jury. But the attorneys could have said, no, we don't want her on our jury. And that would have been a challenge, as you see below the voir dire. And then finally, yes, I did get picked on that jury, and it was an 8-day trial, and it was exhausting and overwhelming and really sad. But it was interesting. All in all, it was interesting. So anyways, okay, jury nullification. Let's say at the end of that trial, myself and all the other people on that jury said, this guy is guilty, and we hereby find that he is guilty of all the charges filed against him. Well, the judge can step in and ultimately say, I disagree with you, and overturn the conviction. So, okay, so we have different types of witnesses, too. We have lay witnesses. Lay witness is just like you and me, like a normal person from the street who may have witnessed the crime or have some other information about the crime. An expert witness is probably someone who did not actually witness the crime, but is an expert in some area regarding the evidence that's being set forth. So things like a fingerprint expert, maybe a medical examiner, maybe you're a firearms expert, things like that. Those are experts that are usually paid, certainly by the defense, to testify to some fact in court. But generally speaking, they were not witnesses in the actual case. Subpoenas, those are orders to appear. A subpoena, and that is how you spell subpoena. That is when a court orders someone to appear in court, maybe even to bring something with them. But a subpoena is an order to appear in court. Contempt of court is an actual criminal charge. It's a misdemeanor. But contempt of court is when a person is either not complying with a court order or being out of order in court, meaning yelling, swearing, talking when they're not supposed to, things like that. So if you're not complying with the courts, you could be found in contempt of court. Victims, and yes, do victims have a role in this court process? They absolutely do. It is, in my experience, unfortunate how few victims, number one, come forward, and number two, are really heard in court. But yes, they do have a role in the court process. If it is adult court, they're allowed to be present for every court hearing. Juvenile courts are not necessarily. They may be, but it's usually up to the judge to make that decision. And can they make a victim impact statement? Absolutely. That is really important, especially for sentencing purposes, so that the court can consider the impact that the crime had on the victims, because sometimes they do get left out. But we have victim advocates that work for the probation departments, and generally speaking, they will walk the victims through the court process and be there as a support system. So yeah, victims do have a role. Oh, and that's it. Yay.